Everybody, welcome. Hopefully you guys are here for the top 10 risk management mistakes CISOs still make. I am Josh Sokol, and this is my good friend and coworker, Alan Proctor. Alan, you want to say something about yourself?
Yeah. Hi. So I've been here at SimpleRisk for about 3 years. Prior to coming here, I was at a Fortune 5 US-based healthcare company for about 7.5 years. I had 3 tours of duty at that location. I started out leading a team of 16 where we were doing assessments across 70 different business units, PCI, High Trust, SOC 2, and Sarbanes. My second tour of duty, I was leading their GRC program development where we built for their internal HSA bank. And then lastly, for their external healthcare clients. Prior to that, I was at SunGuard, where I was a PCI QSA, doing reports on compliance as well as assessments, and 27001 and 002 assessments. Had a great question one time during an interview. Alan, what's not on your resume? What's not on my resume is that out of my 30-year career, I've been in and out of about 50 different companies, mostly as a consultant, across all the industry verticals except for government, because government one kind of scares me a little bit.
That is the least exciting thing I've ever heard. I'm Josh Sokol. I'm the CEO and CISO of SimpleRisk. I've been a CISSP. I spent 10 years running the information security program at National Instruments. I started SimpleRisk back in 2013 because spreadsheet-based risk management just sucked. I spent a long time using Excel, doing my risk management process, and eventually I was like, there has to be a better way. And there really wasn't unless you wanted to pay like $500,000. So I created an open source tool to do that. SimpleRisk is still free, it's still open source, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. I am also a former OWASP board member. I have been like wanting to come to Snowfrock for almost 2 decades now. I used to run the Global Conferences Committee, and I heard about all the amazing things that were happening here in Denver. And I am delighted to be here today. And for my, I think, more exciting things. So expertise, organizational governance, risk management, compliance, that's why we're here. Secure application development lifecycle, spent a lot of time in that. But I think the more interesting thing is I actually do origami dollar bills. It was something that started as the tooth fairy. My wife and I used to give the kids dollar bills for the tooth fairy thing, and I used to go and make origami out of the dollar bills. So with that, let's get started with a quick story. I mentioned my wife. I've got a wife and 4 daughters. And a few years ago, I was on a flight and we were going to Honolulu. And the skies were super clear as we were leaving California when we took off. Smooth, perfect. But then about halfway in, the pilot comes over the intercom. He's like, folks, we're heading into some turbulence. Please buckle your seatbelts. If you've ever been on a plane, you've probably heard that before. Suddenly, the plane starts shaking. It's dropping. It's bouncing around. And you could look around and you can see the tension on people's faces. They're gripping the armrest. They're looking around nervously. And naturally, my kids slept through it all. But I will never forget the look of terror as I looked at my wife's face next to me. Right? It looked like that. But up in the cockpit, the pilots weren't panicking. They weren't like, we're all going to die. Why? Because they expected turbulence. They knew it was coming. They had the instruments, they had the training, they had the procedures, so they knew how to handle it. And here's the thing. In aviation, turbulence is inevitable. But the crash, that's something that's preventable. And risk management works very much the same way. The storms are out there. We have cyber threats. We have compliance changes. We have operational disruptions. And we can't control when they appear. What we can control is whether we're prepared for them and whether we recognize the hidden mistakes that make our organizations vulnerable. So that's why we're here today. And over the next 45 minutes or so, Alan and I are going to share the top 10 mistakes that I see organizations make in managing risk. And these are even strong ones, the mature ones, the ones that we look at and we go, they know what they're doing. Even those mature CISOs and mature programs still have problems. And my goal isn't to scare you, it's really to give you a clearer radar, stronger flight plan, so that when the turbulence comes, and it inevitably will, you guys are ready. And by the way, in case you hear my breath, a little bit out of breath, it's because I'm not from Denver, I'm from Texas. And you guys are a little higher than we are. So, Ellen?
All right, before we dive into the top mistakes, let's get a quick read of the room. Raise your hand if you're still tracking your risks in spreadsheets.
Yeah.
No shame. It's actually how SimpleRisk started. Josh built it because spreadsheet-based risk management it just doesn't scale. Now, here who does formal risk assessments once a quarter or even less often? Oh, all right. It's more common than not. You'll see why that's our first big mistake coming up. What about defined risk appetite statements, something your leadership actually signed off on? All right, that's usually where we start to see turbulence between business and security. Next one, whose executives regularly talk about risk metrics in business reviews? Oh, not nearly enough hands. That's mistake number 2. Last one, who's ever felt like their GRC process is, let's say, over-engineered? You're not alone. You don't need a jumbo jet for a puddle jump. We'll talk more about that later. So just by that quick show of hands, you can already see that most organizations are flying through risk management with just a little bit of turbulence. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today.
Awesome. So a couple months ago, I gave a version of this talk at the Navitaire Customer Conference. And the audience was mostly enterprise CISOs, risk managers, people who were worried about business risks, compliance risks, audit findings, board reporting. This is a little bit of a different crowd. You guys live a little closer to the code. You're thinking about vulnerabilities, dependencies, CI/CD, threat modeling, all the stuff that Tanya talked about this morning, maybe a little chaos engineering. We have a few chaos monkeys in the room, maybe. So why should you guys care about risk management mistakes that CISOs make? You're obviously here. You think it's an interesting topic, right? Those numbers don't stay in the boardroom. They cascade all the way down to the SDLC. And when leadership doesn't define the risk appetite, our development teams get mixed signals. One week it's ship fast. The next it's, why wasn't this threat modeled, right? So when risks and controls aren't linked, security tests become checkboxes instead of our priorities. And when risk communication fails, guess who gets blamed when something goes wrong? It's you guys. It's the people at the keyboards, right? So today, we're not just talking about how CISOs mess this up. We're talking about those same patterns and how they affect you guys, whether you're building, you're testing, you're running the code that keeps the business flying. So think of this as a lesson learned at 30,000 feet and bringing it down to the application layer because turbulence happens at every altitude. But before we take off, I want to talk a little bit about our flight plan today. So just like a pilot doesn't jump into the cockpit without a route, we don't want to wander through the topic without a roadmap. So here's our journey. We're going to start off, we're going to talk about strategic blind spots. These are the areas where a lack of alignment or one-time assessments can leave you guys flying blind. Then we'll talk about operational missteps. This is the turbulence caused by weak processes, over or under engineering, and unlinked controls. Third, we'll talk about culture and communication failures. These are the hidden storms that are created when risk isn't communicated effectively or culture discourages action. It happens a lot. And then finally, we'll kind of land with some key takeaways, actionable checklists. We'll have a little Q&A. Slides. There will be a QR code at the end. You guys don't have to take pictures or anything like that. All the slides you'll be able to download. I want you guys to be able to pay attention to hear. You heard the slides are available and you decide to leave. By the end of this flight, my goal is for you guys to have a clear view of the top 10 mistakes in risk management and practical ways to navigate around them, maybe even prevent a disaster or two along the way.
All right, with our flight path set, let's start at the beginning. The part of the journey that sets the direction for everything else. Strategic blind spots are the areas where organizations often fly without instruments, without guidance, and without full awareness of the risks ahead. If you don't get this right, everything downstream, operational decisions, culture, communication, can be off course. Let me tell you a quick story about one of my previous clients that I worked with a few years ago. It's a large manufacturer with a global footprint. They had what they thought was a solid risk management process. Every quarter, the InfoSec team would meet, run a risk assessment, update their spreadsheet, and report to leadership. Everything looked great, green across the board, until one day, a critical supplier suffered a ransomware attack. The problem? That supplier wasn't even on their radar during their last quarterly review. The risk hadn't been reassessed in months, so when the attack hit, they were blindsided. Production stopped, customers were delayed. The next board meeting, let's just say it got turbulent. So what went wrong? It wasn't a lack of intelligence or planning, it was timing. They were checking the weather once before takeoff, assuming the skies would stay clear for the whole flight. But risk isn't static, it's dynamic, changing with every new dependency, system update, or vulnerability disclosure. That's why the best programs don't treat risk assessments as events. They treat them as continuous monitoring processes. Because if you're only updating your risk register quarterly, you're already flying blind for 89 out of those 90 days. In today's threat landscape, that's a lot of turbulence waiting to happen. Question, how often do your risk assessments give you a true real-time view of your organization's risk landscape? Once a year? Quarterly? Monthly? Continuous? If your answer is once a year, you're not alone, but that approach has some important limitations. Imagine a pilot preparing for takeoff. They check the weather once, months in advance, and decide the flight is fine. They never check again during the flight. Storms, turbulence, sudden winds, completely unseen. That's what happens in many organizations when risk management is treated as a once-a-year exercise. This brings us to mistake number one, one-time risk assessments. For a lot of organizations, risk assessments look like this. Once a year, someone pulls out a framework. Maybe it's ISO, maybe it's NIST, maybe it's PCI. They fill in the form, check some boxes, create a heat map, and done. File it away until next year on top of the cubicle to gather dust until next year. The problem? Risks don't follow your calendar. They emerge, they shift, and they escalate constantly. Cyber threats don't wait until Q4. Supply chain issues don't respect fiscal years. And regulations don't line up neatly with the audit cycle. Treating risk as a once-a-year exercise gives you a snapshot of when what you really need is radar. Imagine if a pilot only checked the weather once before takeoff and never again during that flight. That's exactly what many organizations are doing with risk. Modern risk management has to be continuous, not episodic. It means building feedback loops into your operations, regular updates from IT, security, legal, compliance, and the business. It means a risk register that lives, breathes, and changes in real time. So now that we've talked about one-time assessments, leave organizations flying blind, the next question becomes, even if you continuously track risks, who is actually steering the plane? That brings us to mistake number two, weak executive alignment.
So too often, risk management is positioned as a compliance activity, not a business enabler. And the board cares about things like revenue growth, market expansion, customer experience. Risk gets presented in technical jargon. It doesn't get connected to the priorities that the board cares about. And the result of that is that risk becomes a side conversation, not a boardroom conversation. Executives nod politely, and then they move on to what they consider as the real business. So here's the reality. If risk isn't tied directly to strategy, it gets ignored, period. I'll give you an example. You imagine the CISO presenting to the CEO, presenting to the board, and he says, we have 5 high risks, 2 cyber, 1 compliance, 1 vendor, 1 operational. What do you think the CEO hears? Expensive problems, right? So now imagine reframing that. One of these risks could cost us $25 million in lost bookings if our reservation system goes down during the peak season. All of a sudden, the conversation is about producing or protecting revenue. something that every executive in our organization understands, the bottom line. And the organizations that do this well translate risk into business impact. And then they align that with the strategic objectives of the organization. That's how you guys earn the executive buy-in and the budget to be able to fix these issues. And here's the kicker. Even when you do get executive attention, without a clear definition of your risk appetite, decisions still end up being inconsistent. And that's mistake number 3.
So imagine a plane preparing for takeoff on a runway with no markings, no signs, and no boundaries. You might get off the ground, but you won't know if you're on course, too high or too low until it's too late. That's what it's like when an organization doesn't define its risk appetite, the level of risk it's willing to accept before corrective action is needed. Without those boundaries, every decision becomes an improvisation. You see it all the time. One executive says, "We can't tolerate even a minor cyber incident." Or another executive at the same company says, "It's fine. Speed matters more than security." The result, confusion, conflicting priorities, and sometimes dangerous exposure. A defined risk appetite paints the runway lines. It gives everyone a shared compass. How much risk are we willing to take? Where do we need mitigation? Where do we hit the brakes and say no? And remember, risk appetite is not a one-size-fits-all. You might accept more market risk to drive growth, but have zero tolerance for safety or regulatory failures. That clarity keeps the whole organization flying in formation. And when there's no shared understanding of risk appetite, risk often gets seen only as a threat, which brings us to mistake number 4, treating risk only as something to fear.
So too often risk management is about protecting the downside. We want to stop the breaches. We want to prevent the fires. We want to avoid the outages. And while that's all important, it's only half the story. So in aviation, risk management doesn't just prevent crashes. It's also an enabler for safer, faster, more efficient flights. And similarly in business, smart risk-taking opens opportunities. So think about digital transformation, cloud adoption, AI automation. They all introduce new risks. If you were here for Chris's presentation before, he's talking about all these risks with AI. They also deliver a competitive advantage if they're managed well. So organizations that view risk as both a threat and an opportunity, they shift the conversation from compliance cost center to strategic enabler. And that's the shift that our executives care about. So by now we've covered the first cluster, the strategic blind spots. We've talked about one-time risk assessments all the way to undefined risk appetite. These are big picture issues. They set our flight path. But even with a well-defined strategy, the journey can still hit turbulence. And that's where operational missteps come in. So strategic alignment tells you where to fly, but operations determine how we get there. And if processes aren't solid, controls aren't linked to our risk, solutions are over or under-engineered, the plane can veer off course, even with a perfect map. So let's move into the next cluster, operational missteps. This is the turbulence that can throw our risk program off track if we're not careful.
Another company I worked with, every department tracked risk in their own way. Finance had a spreadsheet, IT had Jira, operations, well, I kept a Word document on somebody's laptop. At first, everyone thought they were doing a great job. Each department saw risks from their own perspective and felt confident they were managing them. But here's the problem. 3 different teams had actually identified the same major operational risk, the potential for supply chain disruption, and nobody realized it. Because the risks weren't shared, nobody connected the dots. By the time leadership noticed, the company had already experienced a delay that could have been avoided. It was like 3 pilots flying blind, thinking they were in control, but all heading straight into the same storm. The lesson? Siloed risk isn't inefficient, it's dangerous. Risk management only works when risk, controls, and insights are visible and connected across the organization. In many organizations, each department manages risk its own way. IT tracks cyber threats, legal handles compliance, operations manages safety, finance watches for fraud. No one's talking to each other. It's like having multiple planes flying in the same airspace, each on its own flight plan with no air traffic control. Everyone's focused on their own path until they cross. This kind of fragmentation creates blind spots. One team might be mitigating a risk that another is unknowingly reintroducing somewhere else. Or you get duplicated effort. Different teams building overlapping controls, wasting time and resources. The solution is integrated visibility, a single view of risk across the organization. That doesn't mean everyone owns every risk. It does mean everyone operates from the same radar screen. When risk ownership is shared, communication improves, response times drop, and leaders can prioritize where it matters most. Now that we've talked about siloed risk ownership, where controls fail because no one team is fully accountable, it's natural to ask, even when ownership is clear, are the controls themselves designed effectively? This brings us to mistake number 6, over or under engineering your risk controls.
I love this picture.
Me too.
I've worked in a few organizations that did things this way. So on one side, you have over-engineering, an organization that's so focused on compliance and controls that every process has a dozen approvals. You got multiple redundant tools, you have reports that literally nobody is going to read. It slows everything down. Innovation stalls, employees are getting frustrated, and you guys end up with a box-ticking culture rather than effective risk management. On the other side is under-engineering, where you have too few controls, you have weak procedures, no clear accountability. It's like flying a plane with missing instruments. You hope everything goes smoothly, but when turbulence hits, you're completely unprepared. So the key here is balance. You want controls that actually mitigate risk without creating unnecessary bureaucracy, and simplicity wherever possible without leaving critical gaps. So in aviation terms, over-engineering is like having 6 redundant seatbelts on a single seat. You can imagine that would be incredibly cumbersome, confusing, unnecessary. Under-engineering is like having no seatbelt at all, which is just risky and dangerous. So the lesson here is build just enough structure to manage your risks effectively. No more, no less. And always validate that controls are delivering measurable value, not just adding additional paperwork. So even when you get the level of engineering right, the next problem is that risks and controls are often not connected properly. And that brings us to mistake number 7, which is deceptively simple, but incredibly common, unlinked risks and controls.
Many organizations have a perfectly defined risk register and a separate list of controls, policies, and procedures. On paper, looks impressive, but here's the problem. If there's no clear connection between the risk and the control that mitigates it, you have no idea if your efforts are actually addressing the right threats. Think of it like this. In aviation, you might have every instrument available in the cockpit, but if the pilot doesn't know what instrument corresponds to which risk, altitude, fuel, engine performance, they're still flying blind. In business terms, you could have dozens of controls in place, but if they don't map to your most critical risks, your organization is exposed. Worse, you're spending time and money on activities that don't move the needle. Let's zoom in on a common operational misstep that's especially relevant for an AppSec audience, DevSecOps integration. When risk and controls aren't linked, your SDLC basically becomes a guessing game. Teams think they're secure because they're following processes, but if those processes aren't connected, you're still flying blind. Here are some examples I've seen frequently. Threat modeling without mitigation tracking. Teams identify threats early in design, but there's no follow-through to ensure that those mitigations actually get implemented. It's like identifying turbulence on your radar, but not plotting a course around it. Dev teams accepting risk without CISO visibility. Often developers make decisions to bypass certain security checks, to hit deadlines, and leadership never sees it until an incident occurs. This is a recipe for operational turbulence as well. The takeaway here is simple. Link your risk identification to your controls and make sure someone is monitoring that link. In DevSecOps terms, that means your threat models, your CI/CD checks, and approvals need to talk to each other. Otherwise, you end up with a pipeline where security exists in theory, but not in practice, all the while deploying software into production and unknown risks. Oh, oops. Sorry about that. See this pipeline? The missing link between identify risk and apply control, that's the exact spot where organizations often crash. Your goal as a CISO or security leader is to make sure nothing falls through that gap. The fix is simple in concept. Though it takes discipline, every risk should have one or more linked controls, and every control should clearly map back to a risk that it mitigates. This creates accountability, ensures coverage, and allows leadership to see what's actually protecting the organization. So far, we've covered strategy and operational missteps, annual assessments, executive alignment, risk assessment, over and under engineering, and unlinked controls. But even when processes are in place, culture and communication often become the hidden turbulence that trips organizations up. That brings us to cluster 3.
So culture and communication are the cockpit instruments of risk management. And without them, you guys are flying blind. So let me give you a concrete example from my own experience at National Instruments back in 2017. So it was really early in my tenure running InfoSec at National Instruments. And one of our vulnerability scanners flagged a critical Apache struts flaw in a public-facing web server. It was Sev 10, remote command execution possible. So I went to the developer responsible for this issue. And I said, hey man, our scanner found this issue. And the dude was swamped, right? He had features that the business told him they needed yesterday. And he said he'd put it in the backlog. And so I did what any good security person would do. I escalated to his manager. And I got the same response. He said, the developer's busy, we'll address it later. So at that moment, I had 3 options. Option 1, I could do nothing. I could hope that it gets fixed eventually. Someday, they'll find it in the backlog, decide to actually fix that problem. Option 2, I could try to persuade the team, which was likely futile because they had already told me no. And option 3 is I could escalate. I could escalate to their director, the guy who's responsible for that development organization. Now I chose option 3. And the result of this was the director supported me, which was great. The issue got fixed, which was great, but not without friction. See, the developer, he felt like I added work to an RA overloaded schedule. Not good. The manager was a former military guy, and he felt that I bypassed the chain of command. They literally brought me into a room to yell at me because I went above their heads. Fortunately, I had a heads up that was going to happen. I had all the data ready to prove that this was a problem. So weeks later, the Equifax breach hit. It was the exact same vulnerability that I mentioned. That was the entry point for the Equifax breach. So I'm going to ask you guys, knowing what I potentially prevented for this organization, what do you guys think? Did I do the right thing by escalating in the organization? I see some nodding heads. Yes. Thumbs up. Does anybody feel like I didn't? You guys hate me? Feel like I did? No. All right. So I'll tell you guys, if I had to do it all over again, I don't think I would have done it any differently. The lesson here is clear. Emerging risks, they don't wait for our schedules. They don't wait for our processes. They don't wait until we feel warm fuzzies about the comfort zones, right? Culture and communication can make or break your ability to respond. So just like that struts vulnerability, many threats appear before anyone recognizes them as critical in our organization. And if our organizations aren't scanning the horizon, if we're not communicating effectively, if we're not empowering the right people to act, those risks can escalate into disasters. Emerging risks, they're not hypothetical. It's why we're here at this conference. They're happening every day, oftentimes quietly. And that brings us directly to mistake number 8, ignoring emerging risks. So many organizations are so focused on the known risks, cyber, compliance, operational, that they miss these new, evolving threats that oftentimes appear overnight. They can be technological, like AI misuse. They could be supply chain automation failures, geopolitical, trade restrictions, environmental, like climate events disrupting our operations. So think of it like a pilot flying into clear skies, and then they're blindsided by a sudden storm. If you're not scanning ahead, if you're not monitoring the horizon and adjusting your course, you're going to be reactive instead of proactive. So the reality here is that the risk landscape evolves faster than most of our governance cycles. Emerging risks aren't in last year's heat map or the annual risk assessment. They're going to need continuous horizon scanning, threat intelligence, scenario planning. Organizations that embrace this mindset, they can identify potential threats early. They can prepare mitigations in advance. They can even turn emerging risks into opportunities, like artificial intelligence. Like competitors that are hesitant to adopt new technology or practices, if you can embrace them safely, gives your organization a leg up. So we've established that emerging risks require constant vigilance, horizon scanning, scenario planning. But even when you identify those risks early, another problem often undermines your ability to act effectively, and that's poor quantification.
Many organizations rely solely on qualitative measures, red, yellow, green, high, medium, low. While that gives a sense of priority, it does not communicate impact in a meaningful way to decision makers. Boards, CEOs, and business leaders, they don't make funding or strategic decisions based on colored squares on a slide. They want to know, how much could this cost if it happens? How likely is it? What's the potential impact on revenue, operations, or reputation? In aviation terms, it's like telling a pilot altitude risk is high, without saying how many feet above the minimum safe altitude you are in, or what could happen if you descend further. The warning is useless without context. Quantifying risk, even roughly in financial or operational terms, allows leadership to prioritize resources, approve mitigations, and make informed decisions. Without it, risk remains a vague advisory exercise and your team loses credibility. Even when risks are quantified, poor communication can keep leadership from acting. This brings us to our final mistake, ineffective communication.
So you can have all the right assessments, the controls, the quantifications, but if the message doesn't land with your audience, it's as if it never existed. And a lot of CISOs struggle with this. They're presenting complex risk data in technical terms that executives or board members don't understand. And the result is missed funding, delayed mitigation, or decisions that are made based on intuition rather than evidence. So think of it like a pilot trying to give instructions over a static field radio. The flight tower never receives the message, and everyone is flying blind. So the solution is tailoring communication to your audience. Translate technical risk into business impact and decision-relevant metrics. Use stories, scenarios, analogies like we're doing today, like the turbulence one, to make the risk tangible so that people feel the association. And provide clear options and recommendations. Don't just report a problem, suggest a course of action. So by this point, we've talked about strategy, we've talked about operations, we've talked about culture, we've talked about how all of them play a role in managing risks effectively. But what I want to leave you with is one image that ties it all together. The CISO as an air traffic controller. Stick with me. Think about what an air traffic controller does. They don't fly the plane, they don't fuel the plane, they don't design the plane, but they do make sure that every one of them gets where it needs to go safely, without crashing into each other. So as CISOs, as security leaders, we're in the same position. We can't control every plane that's in the sky, every developer's decision, every vendor's configuration, every new initiative taking off before our security teams sign off. What we can control is the communication. Bless you. We can make sure the right people have visibility, the right teams are talking to each other, and that risks are called out before they turn into mid-air collisions. That's culture. Culture isn't a policy. It's not a framework. It's not a dashboard. It's the invisible coordination between people and teams that keeps our organization flying smoothly, even when there's turbulence. So if you take one thing away from this presentation today, it's this. You don't have to control every plane. Trying to control every plane is futile. Just make sure everyone's tuned into the same frequency. So let's pull together the key lessons and how to navigate safely. Please build up.
Okay. So 1, risk management is continuous, not episodic. Annual assessments are not enough. You need living, breathing processes. 2, alignment with leadership is critical. Risk is a business conversation, not just a technical one. 3, balance controls effectively. Over-engineering slows you down. Under-engineering leaves you exposed. 4, link everything. Risk, controls, quantification, and communication. They must work together. 5, culture and communication matter. Emerging risks, quantification, and messaging cannot be ignored. The right culture ensures your program is resilient and actionable.
All right, so now it's time that we take action. Look at your own program and ask yourself, where are you flying blind? Ask yourself which controls aren't linked to real risks. Ask yourself, are your risk metrics truly meaningful to your board, to your executive leadership team? And ask yourself, is your communication landing? And my challenge to you guys today is to identify the top 1 or 2 turbulence points in your program this week. That's your takeaway from this conference. Or I guess it's Friday, so maybe next week. You guys can have the weekend. And then take concrete steps to address them. So even small adjustments can significantly improve your flight path. All right. So rather than asking you guys any questions and making this super awkward, let's make this interactive. So this guy right here, that's the QR code for the presentation. It's PDF, download it. I'm going to leave this slide up so that we can talk through it. So my first question for you guys is, which of these 10 mistakes that we talked about today hits closest to home for your organization? This is a safe space, by the way. Nobody. You're like, lunch is coming, let me go. Define risk appetite. Absolutely. That was a big one for me when I was starting out, was how much risk could my organization tolerate? How much could we accept before bad things started happening? I saw a hand over here.
Yeah, for us as executive alignment, we have a lot of different groups, they have a lot of different priorities, but they don't cross over, so we don't know how it impacts everything.
Yeah, so weak executive alignment, lots of groups, they're not really communicating effectively, and that's causing problems within the organization. So how do we get the executive leadership team to communicate effectively, to understand what risks are there? A lot of this comes back to our spreadsheet risk management, honestly. So if every team is keeping their own spreadsheet of the risks that they have, there's no ability to go, oh, well, that's a common risk across all these different teams. And this is part of the reason why I created SimpleRisk in the first place, to be honest with you, was I had multiple organizations that all had risks, but they weren't talking to each other. And made it really hard for our management organization to go, well, these guys said they have that, and those guys said that, and those guys said that. We all have the same risks. That immediately bumps up the prioritization for our organization. I saw another hand over here somewhere. What do you think?
I work in government, so it's number 1 for
Number one, okay. Yeah, the one-time risk assessment, like just do it once a year, absolutely. And we need to make sure that this is dynamic. That's continuous assessments. Fortunately, a lot of the AI tools are helping us with this kind of thing too, because we can automate that process, build it into our CI/CD pipeline. So another hand here.
Over and under of engineering.
Yeah, yeah.
Just the painful spot.
Absolutely. I mean, the over-under engineering is one of those things where our organizations were like, you just keep building and keep building and keep building, and all of a sudden people are questioning, like, why do we have all this stuff? And it's not actually mitigating a risk. And I think it was Tanya's presentation earlier, she was saying, evaluate the tools that you have and then slim down, right? Look at what your budget is, make sure you're spending on the things that are giving you the most bang for your buck. Sorry, I'm not trying, if you want to answer any of these,
I'm good.
you're welcome to. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah.
My specialty is human risk, and so often I see the competing priorities.
Yeah.
Gotta get my job done, but also gotta manage the risk.
Yeah, the human risk element is crazy, especially when you start getting into things like data centers and stuff like that, where you're like, okay, that data center, if there's a fire, the doors are going to seal in so much time, and you can't get out. And by the way, there's an oxygen removing system that's going to kill everybody in the room, right? Like, these are the kind of problems that we have and the challenges that we face here. Yeah, what do you think?
I'm coming out of a long stint as a privacy engineer, so number 7 is really hard.
Number 7? Yeah.
And privacy in particular.
Yeah.
The way people think about risk, the way people think about controls is completely unrelated.
Absolutely. Yeah, mapping the risk to the controls is really important. Are there any emerging risks that you guys are seeing that we didn't cover? Did you have one? No? You're just waving at me? I met Patrick this morning. Good to see you, man. Yeah, what do you think? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 So she said that one of the biggest risks is inaction. I'll tell you, when I was running the security program at National Instruments, one of the realizations that I had was that inaction wasn't necessarily a bad thing as long as it was documented. And I think that was the biggest issue in our organization, was people were making conscious decisions not to do anything, but they weren't documenting who was making that decision, why that decision was being made, right? There is a level of risk appetite that organizations have that's okay. We can accept risk because oftentimes accepting some level of risk gives us some competitive advantage, some opportunity that we can take advantage of. But when that risk actually happens, we need to know who signed off on that risk. Did they have the right level of permission to sign off on a risk of that criticality and so on? So it's really important, not that we are ignoring risk. It's okay to say, nah, we're not going to do anything. But we want to make sure that that decision gets explicitly documented.
Yeah, and if I can add something to that, so 2 companies I used to work for come to mind, and that the whole point of the risk appetite is to justify not doing anything. We've decided to accept as an organization 0.04% of revenue of losing it. I said 0.04%, okay, not 0.4. and be okay with that, from a leadership perspective, which means that anything that falls underneath that from a potential threat, potential loss, we are going to ignore it. And it's entirely fine to ignore it.
Any other thoughts? Does anybody have an example of successfully turning a challenge into an opportunity? Is your hand up now?
It is up.
Okay, all right.
I wanted to touch on the emerging risk. Like, we're a super small shop that's in federal space, and so we find that we're really reacting to the controls. And since we're so small, we're overwhelmed with all the different responsibilities, trying to adhere to the control changes that we never really can pick our head up out of the sand and see what's going find out and find that the controls are usually significantly lagging in terms of what's actually going on in space. And so that was the one that stood out to me, where it's like this coming here and being amongst all these colleagues and peers has been very eye-opening in terms of all of the challenges that people are actually experiencing out there that we don't have the time or the resources to experience.
Yeah, I love that thought, by the way. If you look at the control frameworks that are out there, those control frameworks aren't updated annually, right? Like ISO is a great example. Everybody points to ISO as this like, the golden standard for controls. But when you look at ISO, when was the last time ISO was updated? 2022, right? That's the last time ISO was updated. What that means is that you can't rely on a 2022, a 4-year-old framework to tell you what things belong in your organization, what controls your organization should have today in 2026. So we have to look at other sources for what the best controls are for our organization. And oftentimes, to Patrick's point, that means talking with our peers. It means being active on Twitter or X or whatever they're calling it today. It means going to conferences, attending talks, understanding what the current threat landscape looks like, and then design controls based on that. Because we can't just look at all these frameworks and go, oh yeah, they know what's best for us. ISO doesn't mention AI at all, right? The new ISO framework, yeah. Sorry, I meant ISO 27001. Thank you. Good correction. Any other thoughts? Awesome. Well, you guys have been an amazing audience. I really appreciate the interaction with us. It makes things so much better than being like, any questions? No, thank you. Pat on the back. Thank you guys so much. Hope you guys have an amazing conference.
Thank you.